Good evening. Welcome to the WPSU Common Ground Lobby Talk on Islam in Europe. My name is Habiba Badroun. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Africana Research Center at Penn State. And to discuss the topic of Islam in Europe, I'm joined this evening by an impressively international panel. Dr. Tiana Kristic is an assistant professor of history at Penn State. She specializes in the history of the Ottoman Empire and Muslim-Christian relations in the pre-modern era. And she's the author of a forthcoming book that focuses on conversion to Islam in the early modern Mediterranean world. And Dr. Kristic is herself from Serbia. And next we have Dr. Bettina Martez, who is an associate professor of German, Science, Technology and Society and Women's Studies. And she is from Germany and came to the US in the summer of 2006 and is the author of a well-received book on the dialogue between Islam and Christian culture in Europe. And certainly not least, Philip Jenkins is the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of History and Religious Studies at Penn State. He's originally from the UK and has published 20 books, including this year, God's Continent, Christianity, Islam, and Europe's Religious Crisis. Now, to talk about our discussion on Islam in Europe, which I hope the studio audience will join us in, a first question to the panel. Now, in newspapers, we see headlines about tension and conflict, and perhaps our first image of Europe and Islam might be an image of disaffected young men in Paris. But you all come from different national backgrounds in Europe, and so I'd be very interested to hear each of you tell us about your own assessment of the state of relations between Europe and its Muslim minorities. Can we start with you, Dr. Kristic?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, I come from the part of Europe that is not normally thought of as Europe. It doesn't come to your mind first. I come from the Balkans, which is also the region where another kind of opposite impression is, I guess, more in order. Instead of a Muslim aggression, we saw more of aggression against Muslims until very recently. So the challenge is, at least in that part of Europe, which is now becoming increasingly with Bulgarian entrance into the European Union, part of kind of global Europe, the challenges are perhaps a bit different than, let's say, in France or in Germany, simply because there's a lot of reconciliation in the aftermath of the ethnic conflicts, ethno-religious conflicts, perhaps we should say, even though oftentimes I am worried that religion is overemphasized in these analyses and that we talk about Muslim menace. We really have to break this down and talk more about religions such as ethnicity, aspects of it in terms of ethnicity, race, etc. So I think Eastern Europe faces, or Southeastern Europe faces, some unique challenges in terms of accommodating its Muslim population and also accommodating different types of Islam, some more traditional kind of strains of Islam, if you want, because this is also the one region of Europe that has large indigenous communities as opposed to immigrant communities. So this is something I guess we can talk more about later, but there's definitely that clash of Islams within this part of the world.
Absolutely. Well, yes, you've raised many topics that we will follow up on. Dr. Martez, how about you?
I think I would like to stress 2 or 3 points that are a little bit more general that have become clear to me since I've come to the United States, and my view on Europe has changed, or on the relationship between Christianity and Islam in Europe has changed quite a bit. And the first thing that became really clear to me when I came to the States was that in America, and this is not only true for Islam, but in America, religion is all about choice. So it's, you know, it's part of consumer society. You choose your, but Europeans often say, well, how can you, you know, you're Jewish, but how can you be a Buddhist right now? That's strange to us. In Europe, religion is very much tied to race, in a way. Christians are white, and Muslims are, depending on the country, in Germany, the Turks. That's not true, but that's the way we perceive it. So Muslims are either Turks or Arabs, or in England, Pakistanis. So race and religion are tied very close together. And what that does is, when you talk about religion, conversations very, very quickly become racist because race and or ethnicity and religion are so closely tied together. The second thing that I would like to say is that in, I think, almost all European countries, the way we view Muslims and the way we try to get in touch with Muslims is very much informed by the Shoah. Every country, I mean, of course, Germany, but every country has, you know, a special relationship to the Shoah. Many countries collaborated with Germany, and coming from Germany, I can definitely say that Germany still is not at all resolved about the Shoah and about anti-Semitism. We don't talk about that still very much in terms of personal relations. There's so much still under the cover. This uneasiness, all those prejudices, because religion is tied to race, get displaced onto Muslims. And the same stereotypes come up. Muslim conspiracy. Muslims, they live in ghettos, or we need to, place them in ghettos. They're dirty. They have a special look. And if you look at the cartoons, the Danish cartoons, those Muslims, many of the faces that you saw depicted repeat stereotypes of what Jews were supposed to, racial stereotypes of Jewish faces. And this has become more obvious to me since I've been here, because because religion is more about choice, not only, but more about choice, the racial focus of in Europe has become so clear to me.
Thank you, those are fascinating insights. Philip.
Well, I'm from Great Britain, which of course has had a number of fairly disastrous encounters with particular kinds of Muslim-related extremism and terrorism and violence. And I think, for instance, of the bombings on the subway a couple of years ago. And when you look at that, you seem to have the clash of civilizations at its sharpest. And obviously, no one would understate that kind of danger. But having said that, the first thing is I also look at it with a historical point of view. And I'm very well aware that terrorism, of course, is not new to Europe. It's not new with current waves of Islamic extremism. And it's interesting that many of the police officers in London today who are fighting Qaeda-related terrorism are literally the sons and daughters of people who were fighting very secular terrorism, Arab or Irish, 20 or 30 years ago. So partly terrorism goes with the European package. I also underline what people are saying in terms of race. And there's been a fundamental change in Great Britain in the last few years in terms of how problems are defined. In the 1980s and 90s, there were riots in France and Germany and Britain, and they were always described in terms of class, ethnicity, immigrant. And suddenly in 2001, after 9/11, they suddenly became Islamic riots. And I'm always interested that in working-class English cities, the opposite of Muslim is white. It's not Christian. So it's come to be a racial label. And also, as in the other countries, you do very definitely see the battle of different kinds of Islam, more varied, flexible, tolerant kinds of Islam, which I think really have seen the need to fight back, reclaim the religion. I think finally have received some support from the government in so doing. So I'm very struck that perhaps the three of us from different parts of Europe are seeing so many similar themes.
Indeed, yes. And I'm going to open up to the audience questions that you might want to pose, and while you think about that, let me just pick up on one or two of the things that have come up with all three of you about how Islam, the word Islam, sometimes displaces what are very nuanced dynamics that are specifically European. And I wanted to pick that up with you, Dr. Kristic, because you mentioned this word which is not often associated with Islam, which is indigenous. And so if Islam is in parts of Europe not an immigration matter, what can you tell us from the experience of the Balkans, which actually is somewhat different than these dynamics, that maybe the word Islam seems to displace other words like immigration, class, race, etc. But in the Balkans, there's a different history.
Right. Well, Muslims in the Balkans have been there in the region since basically the 15th century, sometimes even 14th century, and are therefore, the question of indigenous always gets related to the issue of origins, which have been used to very malicious ends in the latest conflicts in the Balkans. Of course, the question with the origins of these Muslim communities have been, who are they really originally? Are they really originally Serbs, or are they really originally Croats? The question of their being Muslim has been denied, in part because of the kind of nature of political imagination in the Balkans, meaning that the nationalisms in the Balkans have been perhaps, in contrast to the Western Europe, not anti-clerical. In fact, they were very much tied to the church. And so the kind of this ethno-religious imagination comes together. You're both an ethnic and religious entity. So the Serbs are Orthodox, Croats are Catholic. And so Muslims, what's their ethnicity? And the part of the attempt to solve that was in the context of former Yugoslavia, when Tito, who's a long-term leader of post-World War II Yugoslavia, basically eventually granted the Muslims the ethnic identity as well. They were finally in 1971 allowed to declare themselves as ethnically Muslim, and so Islam became kind of ethnic category as well. But in the latest wars, of course, the discussion about Muslims in Bosnia were discussed in terms, the discussion was in terms of whether they should be expelled because they're foreign, because they're Turks, so there's another ethnic epithet added to them, or they should be forcefully returned to their original ethnic and religious identity, i.e. either Catholic or Orthodox. So the idea that there can be possibly indigenous has been very much rejected by the extant political discourses in the region. So even though, as I said, they were there since the 14th century, the issue of indigenous or origins is still very much part of the debate.
Also, there are far fewer Muslims in Europe than there would have been in earlier periods, because one thing that really Westerners just do not know about is that between the 1870s and the 1920s, a lot of Christians are moved from the Middle East to Europe, but many, many hundreds of thousands or millions of Muslims are deported from Europe to what becomes Turkey. And there's a very large kind of ethnic cleansing which registers on nobody's historical memory.
Thank you for that.
I would also like to add something. There's another indigenous Islam in Europe, which is imaginary. If we think about the, Orientalism, you all know about the paintings, the literature, the travel literature, the fantasies of the Orient as this space of secrecy, of mystery, of adventure, a place where the exhausted subject finds repose and rest. And this is, it's imaginary, but Europe is an imaginary space too. Europe is not only about geography, Europe is about ideas, it's an imagined community. And in this imagined community, within this imagined community, Islam, the Orient, had a big presence, an overwhelming presence, and a stimulating presence. So you could say that this kind of indigenous Islam was what kept the European engine going, the Western engine going, the need for innovation. If you want to progress, you need secrets that you can discover. And the Orient provided this imaginary space of always having something to discover, something new out there for the Western subject to move on.
Indeed. Yes, and of course, the other area of Europe with a very long-standing history of a relation to Islam is Spain, that earlier encounter and empire. But let's ask if members of the audience have any questions for our panels.
Hello, good evening. I'm Herbert. I'm from Austria. I would like to echo also what Bettina said. It's very true also in my small country. I have a lot of friends from Islamic countries back in Austria. They're from North Africa, they're from Lebanon, they're from Iraq, Iran also. And we have good times together, and it's very peaceful. So I would like to ask the panel, how do you explain that element of violence that we normally associate with Islam in general?
A number of things. From the 1950s and 1960s, when you get the immigration to Western Europe, and like I said, the Muslim presence in southeastern Europe is very long-standing. In Western Europe, it's obviously very new. That coincides with the creation of some quite radical, fundamentalist Islamic movements, often associated with active states sponsoring different kinds of fundamentalist violent activity. In England, for example, a lot of Pakistani communities develop an affiliation for a group called Jama'a Islamiyah. But so much of this is from these foreign sources. Besides that, you also have the problem of many disaffected, very poor immigrant communities, and that sort of discontent, which in other conditions would just take the form of social protest, in some cases, like in the French riots in 2005 and 2007, sometimes acquires a religious level. So it's partly the circumstances of that immigration and the timing coinciding with this upsurge of a kind of radicalism worldwide, especially in the 1980s. That would be maybe a short story for what is a much larger answer. But Bettina.
I would like to take a slightly different viewpoint because I don't see that much violence. I see a rhetoric of violence. I see politicians invested in painting a picture of a violent Islam. But I don't see that much. I mean, in Germany, or you mentioned the French riots, I would not connect them to Islam at all. These were, for economic, for social reasons. These young men mostly, they live in these poor neighborhoods. They don't have jobs, or if they have jobs, they do have bad jobs. They don't have any kind of a positive outlook for the future. It's and that is not at all connected to Islam. It's violent, but it's not Islam. But what I mean by the rhetoric of violence is, for example, in Germany, politicians or mostly Muslim women who have been, who have a large press presence and who have been heard by politicians, they talk about a violent Islam. And then people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, yes, she does have, her experience was horrible partly, and this gets picked up by the press, this gets picked up by politicians, and then all of a sudden we talk about violence and Islam, and this seems like the same thing. But I don't see that much.
You make a very important point, and in fact the analogy I would make is in the 1960s there were many riots in the United States by African Americans who were mainly Christian, but we never called them Christian riots.
Yeah,
and I think that's a very good analogy. Yeah. However, having said that, there is a violent subculture there is an extremist subculture of groups like Takfir al-Hijra is an obvious example, which does not have to be very large in numerical terms, but does provide a framework for potential terrorist attacks and organization, and which we have seen in some cases. So I agree with you. I do not associate most of that violence with Islam, but however, there is a terrorist subculture.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in the presence of historians, especially with the last question. And I wonder if you would comment. I very much appreciate your comment on Orientalism and looking at that as a fantasy Islam, but that has a history as well. And if we could go back a little further to colonialism, which I think, if you want to talk about some violence, we might get into some right there, and to understand where it all started, perhaps.
I would push it even further before colonialism. When we talk about today, when we talk about Islam and this Orientalist fantasy, we tend to think we tend to project this way back in the past. Oftentimes it's projected beyond the colonial period into the early modern period, even into the medieval period. And this is something that many of my colleagues, especially colleagues who work on Ottoman history, are trying to move away from and look at the really kind of common conceptual frameworks that were shared by the Muslim and Christian worlds in the period before this supposed outbreak of Orientalism, as Said located in 1798 with the Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. So I think that the emphasis on Orientalism as a fantasy, and sure, it's very useful for the discussions about modern Europe and discourse on Islam in modern Europe, but I think we allowed it to monopolize our study of Islam throughout history, and it completely undermines any kind of intellectual enterprise that would allow us to recover some of the more really shared experiences between the so-called Islamic and so-called Christian civilizations. Times when, you know, the Mediterranean, early modern Mediterranean or medieval Mediterranean really shared kind of the same heartbeat, if you want, politically, religiously. There were simply political ideas that Muslim and Christian rulers around the Mediterranean followed and aspired to. And so I would, as a historian, if you're insisting on a historian's perspective, first of all, insist that we do not project the Orientalist issue or Orientalist vision way back in the past, before, at least before the more recent developments, even though, as your question about the colonial encounters, of course, very important to the more recent discussions.
That same heartbeat, a very, resonant phrase. Is there also evidence of that happening today? We started off our own discussion by pointing out that the headlines tend to respond to tension and conflict, but as one of our questioners also pointed out, there are other kinds of interactions, and is that part of the profile in Europe as well?
For me, it is. Let me start with telling you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Frankfurt in Germany, and in the 70s and the 80s. And at that time, Frankfurt was the only multicultural city in Germany, with an office for multicultural affairs in the city hall. And in my high school, we were, some white Christian Germans, people from Spain, people from Turkey, and religion just wasn't an issue. We knew we came from different backgrounds, and I went to a school where those issues were addressed. So, the teachers made an effort to have all of us speak about our cultural backgrounds, cultural heritages, history, etc. And we got along very well. I learned a lot about both different cultures, also religion, but it wasn't, those people from Turkey, those teenagers, they weren't singled out, well, you're Muslim. No, we were all, there were Jews in the class, there were Christians, there were Muslims, there were people who came from atheist backgrounds. It worked very well, and for me, looking back at this now, I might may sound nostalgic, but this was a time where, yes, we got along well because the political rhetoric at that time, at least in Frankfurt when I was growing up, this rhetoric of violence wasn't there, and it worked.
Thank you.
Just a thought about the common heartbeat. I'm actually very optimistic about these issues, partly on the grounds of the time frame. Think of the very short time frame that Western Europe has had substantial Muslim communities. It's about 30 to 40 years. That's a very, very short time in historical terms. Already, people used to talk about Muslims overwhelming Europe. What's actually happening in many ways is that Europe is overwhelming the Muslims who are there, and that the two cultures really are sharing a great deal in many ways. And what's interesting is that the cultures that are being formed there are also having their influence on the home countries of migration, on Algeria, on Morocco, on Turkey, and you're seeing it, for instance, in attitudes to the role of women, you're seeing it in family size. And so the idea was that you would see this thing called Eurabia, that Muslims would conquer Europe. Well, if it is a Eurabia, if it is this common heartbeat, it seems to be at least as much on European terms. And as I said, look at this in the long term, look at the next 30 or 40 years, and I think the prospects are actually very good.
Now, Dr. Christic, you're talking about a situation where, in fact, the history of Muslim presence in Europe is much longer. But, is there also the sense of a more positive vision that is not seen in the headlines? Or, in fact, does that contradict Philip's point that, a longer timetable will inevitably bring this convergence and level of tolerance and acceptance?
Well, the period that I tend to study and that I tend to talk about is really the early modern period, where the power structure was very different. Today we're talking mostly about the Western precedence over the East, and in the early modern era that wasn't the case. The Ottoman Empire, which is the longest-lasting Muslim empire in history, was actually very dominant in that period, certainly between the 15th and the 18th centuries, roughly. And from that position, it was able to dictate, in a way, a very different type of interaction, interaction in which competition for an imperial identity was very much up for grabs. You could, and there were various other kind of shared conceptual frameworks, not only the competition for who will be that one emperor of the kind of Mediterranean world, or the known world, if you want, but which was contested both by the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, for example, and many other European players in the early modern era, but also kind of more religious frameworks, if you want, which we usually take as the key marker of difference. In fact, I would argue that in the early modern period, that was not the case. That there was a lot of shared religious content that was then contested in different ways, but every player acknowledged that the kind of symbolic capital that's contested is the same symbolic capital. What I'm talking about is particularly the idea of the one religious truth, the one emperor who will unite the entire world under the rule of one religion and one empire. These were ideas that were prevalent and acknowledged in the early modern era, and that's why I'm talking about these shared concepts, politically and religiously, if you wish.
Let's go to a question again from the audience.
I was curious to find out, as you mentioned earlier, that there's only been a few decades for Europe to incorporate the Muslim community, especially in the western portion of the continent. Right. Could you compare this to something that we saw in the United States 100 years ago? It was when the Eastern Europeans came to the United States, whereas we didn't directly incorporate them, and it took time, and it took time for the community to learn that Eastern Europeans were okay too. I mean, is this something that we can hope to look to see that in 30, 40, 50 years from now, that we're not going to still have this clash of civilizations continuing?
Thank you.
Well, to think about it in exact chronological terms. Mass immigration, Catholic, Jewish immigration into the United States began in about 1890, in the 1880s. Think where we were in the 1920s. In the 1920s in the United States, we had a nativist movement, which was the Ku Klux Klan, which was several million strong, that was entirely devoted to being anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish. They were armed, they were a militia, people were talking about civil war, they were talking about violence. It sounds rather like Europe today in a lot of ways. And then, of course, you look at those immigrants and the children of those immigrants a decade or a couple of decades later, and you're dealing with super patriotic Americans. And I don't think that that analogy is far-fetched. If you look at how America was doing with its immigrants in the 1920s and 1930s, the present European situation does not look at all bad. And in fact, from the view of Protestant Americans back in 1900, Protestants viewed Catholics at that time with exactly the same range of stereotypes that many modern Europeans view Islam. In fact, almost exactly the same issues. There are schools where they teach strange alien doctrines. And if you look at something like that, I think it's actually very encouraging, but I think that's a very good historical analogy.
Mm-hmm. You know, a number of people in the audience and here as well have created very resonant comparisons. And I wonder, you know, how compelling is it to look at other minorities in Europe, for instance, as examples? You had raised the issue of the Jewish community and the way in which Germany looks to its relations with the Jews as a way to tell a story after the Shoah. Is that a possibility? Do you see Muslims actually starting to occupy a different position in these different European nations, where the story of Islam can be part of the way these nations tell their own narratives?
That's a very positive vision, and I would hope that this would come true. But what I meant when I said that the Shoah informs the image of Islam is that this is an unconscious process. If you ask Germans or people from the Netherlands or even from France, they would say, no, that's different. You know, we're not confusing the two. But if you look at the images and if you look at the discourse, you do see that there are these displacements happening, but it's not conscious yet. And I think if Europe or the different countries in Europe really want to engage with Islam, what we need to do first is we need to know more about ourselves. We need to analyze our national unconscious or our European unconscious. We need to redirect the gaze. We need to look at ourselves, because what's happening now is when we look at Islam, what we see but we don't know is we see our own hidden face. We see the difference that resides in ourselves, but this is an unbearable difference because we believe in the unified subject. We believe we have one identity, and that's fine, that's the way it is, and the other is the other. We don't know that we project the difference that resides in ourselves onto the other. So we need to, if we want to engage with Islam, a conversation involves both speaking with the other, but not abusing the other as a projection of myself, and talk about ourselves too. And this has to happen at the same time.
Indeed.
Can we just move away from the idea in a sense of, if you like, speaking to Islam? What many governments have done wrong in the last few years in Europe, and I think they're recognizing this now, is they've recognized that you have these mainly Muslim communities, and they've tried to speak to them through intermediaries who are these big national federations who often represent the most reactionary, backward kind of Islam, whereas ordinary Muslims of different origins basically want to be treated primarily as citizens. Why do you see us, they say, as Muslims, do we have to be squeezed into that role? Why can't we be citizens like everyone else? And I think that's the biggest realization that governments will have to make over the next few years, and I believe they're starting to do it.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? Citizenship is a very good keyword, because there are some European countries that have denied citizenship to immigrants. Germany is, I think, the most well-known example. The mostly Turkish immigrants that came 30, 40 years ago they're not citizens. Their children who were born in Germany could not be citizens. And this is, of course, a huge problem because you have in some cities, very big minority of people who want to participate, who pay taxes, but who have no rights. And this creates tension and frustration.
Indeed, yes. So you've raised, very interestingly, the point about the institutional context in which issues like immigration or Islam get treated. Your own experience growing up in Frankfurt, where there was an institution in the city level, the institution of citizenship. So, you know, I think that these are very subtle points to add. And in my own experience of studying in Britain for a year, I would be part of discussions of the BBC where there would be a representative Muslim voice, and Muslim feminists, Muslim anti-racist activists generally tended not to be those representative voices. They tended to be the far more patriarchal, nationally known figures. So even who is Islam tends to be much more limited, despite the fact that there are more interesting, diverse discussions going on.
And I think this is true of Germany and other countries as well as England. The average Muslim person is much more, pardon the expression, a regular person in the sense of not necessarily defining everything they do through the lens of Islam, but just acts very much like their neighbors of whatever faith. But as you say, the people who are on the TV speaking for them will often represent some of these, societies or federations that are rooted elsewhere often.
Indeed.
Yes. I was just going to add apropos both these projections, especially that in this way Europe has really exacerbated its own problem by choosing those spokesmen who usually were very uninformed, in a very uninformed way, and imagining Islam as a monolith as opposed to a variety of religious initiatives. It really propped up those who were most radical and who were ready to dominate the discourse at the expense of the more moderate strains. And this really, speaking, I know Philip attended recently a conference where this was brought up from the British point of view. In the Balkans, this is really affecting the development of Bosnia into a democratic state because inadvertently the international community allowed, for example, Saudi Arabia to completely monopolize the help to Bosnia, thereby infiltrating also much more extreme versions of Islamic teachings that were foreign to Islam in Bosnia, which is more Ottoman, Sufi, etc. And the same thing in Kosovo. Through international help, through the guise of aid, we're introducing or allowing them to introduce really these.
Just a quick footnote, just an observation. Probably the thing which Westerners know least about Islam is that historically Islam is as diverse as Christianity.
Indeed.
It has every one of these different schools, and these official spokesmen, official groups, tend to represent one very small link, and a lot of these other much more, what shall I say, much more peaceful, much more tolerant groups really get squeezed out. And I think that's a common story across the continent.
Right.
Could anybody comment on the exclusion of Tariq Ramadan and other prominent European Muslim scholars from the United States? The fact that so many of them have been denied visas in recent years?
I'll just say Tariq Ramadan's a very interesting character. He represents a school of thought that's emerging in Europe that could potentially be very, very important for the wider Islamic world. Europe is currently performing the role for the wider Islamic world that, say, a tolerant country like the Netherlands provided during the Enlightenment. It was a place where you could discuss ideas you couldn't discuss elsewhere. There's been a lot of debate about Ramadan because many people feel he has a lot of, extremist connections and affiliations. I think the verdict is that when he, rejects violence, rejects extremism, he really is telling the truth, and he really is being the genuine article. So I think that's a shame for that reason. I would stress that Ramadan is one of a number of these groups, a number of these very important individuals who represent a very interesting merger of Islam into European and Western ideas. And those figures, Bassam Tibi, Amr Khaled, represent an interesting bunch of folk who could be very influential.
Right. That also raises the issue again of the containment, the space. Ramadan is not allowed into the U.S., and at the same time, when I spoke with people in the Netherlands recently and asked about this perception of tension in Europe between Europeans and Muslims, the figure that they cited to me, that the fact that they cited to me as a hopeful sign was that Tariq Ramadan's just been appointed to a professorship in Leiden, University of Leiden. So he does represent some other view of Islam and potentiality about Islam, and he's not allowed into the US. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah, I would just like to add to what you said. I think that's why it is so important that the United States pay more attention to what's going on in Europe. I mean, the United States has this image of Islam is the same everywhere, and we know what terrorism is, and we know what's going on. They need to pay more attention to what's going on in Europe. They need to listen to voices from old Europe, and then they will learn that there are voices like Tariq Ramadan who, fight for peace and for integration and all of that.
Thank you. We have another question.
I guess it's following up on that, and to have you talk some about the extent to which U.S. foreign policy and attitudes impact what happens in Europe, either as a contrast or as exacerbating or as helping in any way.
Thank you. Before I allow the panel to respond to that, in fact, the contrast of the U.S. and Europe is an interesting one. I was hearing about a survey among young Muslims in America about their perception of their own position here, and they said, well, thank God we're not in France. So, that contrast between the US and Europe, and following up on Ted's question, can I ask you to respond, any of you?
Well, I think it has to do with what I said before, that I can imagine that Muslims in America are grateful that they're not in France, because they see that in France, ethnicity and race gets conflated with religion, and then it becomes all very difficult, and you can't really talk anymore because you have entered this racial discourse. And as far as I know, and what I see since I've been here, this is not the case in the United States. So this is it's a more relaxed space. There's more tolerance. I don't know about respect or acceptance so much, but there's more tolerance because religion is not so much tied to race.
Indeed. Now, about the issue of foreign policy, did any of you want to take that up as well? Well, let's have Dr. Christie.
I just wanted to add, which is kind of a different perspective. I definitely agree that a lot of the tension is fueled by in Europe is fueled by what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. But I'd also like to add a different perspective, which is that Muslims in Southeast Europe actually are very grateful to the U.S. for, stopping the war in Bosnia in 1995. They, in fact, have very positive and grateful attitude to this, and especially the Albanians in Kosovo, again, for the U.S. for stopping the atrocities in 1999. So, and they, in fact, feel more betrayed by Europe than by the U.S. as a kind of Muslims. So this is something that is not often maybe thought about, but is perhaps interesting to add to the mix.
Indeed, yeah.
To what degree are just run-of-the-mill people in Islamic countries able to access the internet? And are there any websites where you can go and pick up a pen pal on the internet from these countries? Just to open dialogue and talk to other people.
The most popular Arabic websites, which are a huge thing, the number one is Al Jazeera, and the number two is the website of this man Amr Khaled I mentioned, who's this Egyptian preacher who tries to make Islam, relevant and fun and mesh with the modern world. It's interesting. A few years ago, Libya, under Colonel Gaddafi, decided to make nice to Europe and the United States. And the reason they did that was very simple, because so many Libyans had been seeing what life was like in Europe through the internet and through the satellite dishes, which are the big ways of picking up international communication. And they realized that everything they were getting from the government was nonsense. And they realized how far behind they'd fallen, and it was setting off so much disaffection. But if you look at those two things, the internet and the satellite dishes, interesting phrase. In French, these satellite dishes are known as paraboliques. In North Africa, the Muslim preachers, the reactionary preachers, hate them so much, they call them paradiaboliques, because they're of the devil, and they bring the devil's message about women's liberation and all these strange ideas. So there's a huge amount of kind of free communication in that way. You know, it's very much part of the 21st century.
Indeed, yes.
I'd like just to add a little anecdote. There are dating services on the internet. There are whole websites where you can meet people, where you can begin dating and maybe even get engaged, all of that. Where you can, you know, start a sexual encounter maybe. So that's huge.
That's called halal dating.
Oh, really?
Is the name for it. But very often women find the internet, Muslim women find the internet safe space.
Yeah.
And so they're often the main users.
Indeed. There's another question, great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was curious as to what the panel thought the effect of either the entry of Turkey into the European Union or the failure of Turkey to enter the European Union would affect the dynamic of Islam in Europe.
Thank you. Well, perhaps there are two very natural respondents on this side.
Well, I'm not really sure how it is affecting Europe at this point. I know that it's affecting Turkey very much, and adversely, it would seem, in some respects. Even though there is now kind of shifting discourse in Turkey away from even aspiring to entering the European Union, the discourse of what the Turks call inat, which is a kind of deliberate kind of pouting, if you want, of resistance to authority. They're saying, well, we don't really need the European Union. If they don't want us, why would we want to go there? And they're now increasing discussions about alternatives. What is really interesting is that a lot of this new kind of resistance towards the European Union comes from the most secular part of the Turkish society, which is offended, if you want, by this rejection. So I know that from that perspective, things are not. Things are changing in Turkey regarding its own bid to enter and willingness to enter. I think, on the other hand, I do regard some of the more recent developments, the elections in Turkey, and the overall period of the AK Party, or the Justice Party, in power as an overall very positive development in Turkey. But at the same time, the kind of events in Iraq and the rejection of the European Union have really strengthened the nationalist strain within Turkey, which was not there before in such force. And that is really I think the scariest development in Turkey right now is not the Islamist movement, it's the nationalist movement, which is actually carrying out a lot of political murders, curbing the free speech, and etc.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right. And I, you know, from a more Northern European perspective, I would say Europe needs Turkey. I mean, we need Turkey to be part of the European Union if we really want to take a dialogue seriously. Turkey is the perfect country for that, because they can they can talk to so many countries. They can talk to Europe, they can talk to several Muslim countries. It's the perfect bridge, and Europe can just gain from admitting Turkey into the Union. But there's a good reason why Europe doesn't want to do that, because as long as we have Turkey, we can debate about Islam. We have this space where we can project all of our fantasies or stereotypes or fears and certainties onto, and we can debate forever. And I don't think it's not a coincidence that we're postponing Turkey's entry again and again and again, another 5 years, because we want this space.
I would disagree with you on one thing there, which is I don't think they're concerned about projecting their ideologies. I think they're concerned about raw numbers. Which is in Europe at the moment, the whole of Europe west of Russia, you're dealing with approximately 23 million Muslims. If you add Turkey, you add 70 million Muslims. You radically change the proportion. You change the proportion of Muslims in Europe from a really tiny 4.5%, which is what it is right now. And I think we need to underline that. It is so small. And it suddenly would take it up to, what, 15, 20%. That really does change the quantitative dynamic quite substantially.
I agree, but why would that be difficult? I mean,
if those Turks had the right to live and work anywhere in Europe, that would change the dynamics of labor and religious relations across the whole continent. That would be a substantial change.
I disagree, I must say. So, yeah.
So numbers and the unconscious. Let's go to another question from the audience.
We'll have a vote on that later, yes.
Yes.
I know there's some sentiment over in Turkey that is starting to believe that they're not being allowed in because in the European Union, they'd be the only Muslims in the Christian club. How are Muslims reacting to the exclusion of Turkey from the European Union that already do live inside of especially Western Europe?
I think that's an excellent question about the transnational meanings for Muslims in Europe itself. Yes, anybody want to take that up?
Well, from the Turkish perspective, as I said, there is a lot of now rejection of the very idea. We don't want to be part of this Mediterranean. We're already part of the Mediterranean. Why do we have to be made part of a Mediterranean league? And if they don't want us, we don't want them either, right? So there's that part of the debate. I'm really not familiar with what's the discourse within Europe among Muslims regarding this. I'm really not sure. If we're talking about, kind of more radical segments of the Muslim population, I'm sure they don't care about the Turks, because from their perspective, Turks are not good Muslims anyway. So why fraternize on that issue to begin with? So we're talking about different layers of discussion here, and I'm not entirely familiar with.
Yes.
In Germany, I can just add that it would, and many Turks in Germany do say that. They say, well, so you keep excluding Turkey, you keep excluding our culture, the culture of our parents or our grandparents. And many of those Turks are not Germans, although they were born in Germany, so they're not German citizens. So for them, it becomes frustrating because they say, you make us decide either we're Turkish or we have to cut our ties to Turkey, but we're not German because it's so difficult to become a citizen. If Turkey was part of the European Union, this problem would be solved. They could be both. They were citizens of the European Union. They could move freely, and they would not have to choose between Turkey, Germany.
By the way, when Catholic Poland joined the European Union a few years ago, I think only about 2 EU countries accepted the free movement of Catholic Poles.
Yes.
And so, France, for example, or the Netherlands certainly were not going to accept all these outsiders, even though they were Christian.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant point. And Germany had this extra agreement. So for Poles, the borders are still very much closed if they want to permanently work in Germany for the next 4 years, I think.
Britain was one of the countries which accepted Poles, and Great Britain now has more Polish immigrants than Pakistani immigrants in the space of 5 years. Just a revolutionary change.
Indeed. Well, how wonderful it's been to receive your insights from all these very diverse segments of what we now know to be a very complex space, imaginary and real, Europe, and its Muslim minorities. Perhaps we can close by having some final words from each of our panelists. And thank you from me, certainly.
Well, I guess in conclusion, what I would say is that there needs to be much more work devoted to divorcing this, perhaps, projection of us on them, and talk about more about various various interlocutors within Islam that Europeans can talk to, look more, as I said, at these kind of commonalities through history instead of emphasizing constantly the clash and civilizational and ontological differences, supposed differences that supposedly exist there. So my hope is that there will be more sensitivity in scholarship, in media, towards this kind of intellectual and, if you want, emotional project, which I think is crucial for the future of all of us and for this, for coexistence in Europe.
Thank you, Dr. Christic. Indeed, we didn't really touch on the possibility of intellectual exchange and its role, or the arts very much, but perhaps that's the material for a further discussion. Philip.
Just 2 points. One is a numerical point. If you're in the United States and you go to a particular city or state, and you ask, what is it like? What's the population breakup? And you're told, well, it's 95 or 96% white. Then you say, oh boy, so it's a white community. In other words, 4 and 4.5% is such a small minority you don't even see it. Europe has a 4.5% Muslim minority. It is so small by American standards, and the fact that there is so much disturbance about it reflects the very different standards prevailing in Europe, which is traditionally a more homogeneous society. Secondly, the one thing we haven't really talked about is not so much the impact of Islam on Europe, it is of Europe on Islam, which I think is potentially immense, and the impact of Europe on North Africa, on Egypt, on the Middle East, and I think that's the great transformation which you're going to see in demographic terms especially.
I agree. You had mentioned that in some ways Europe is the space where questions can be asked which might not be asked in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, and indeed the traffic back intellectually, religiously, socially, artistically between Europe and other parts of the Muslim world is perhaps the subject of another lobby talk. But Dr. Martez.
Yeah, I would like to stress that what we do need, apart from intellectual discourse or scholarship, is we need face-to-face discussions. We need to talk to each other. People from different backgrounds, with different religions, people who represent different strands within Islam or Christianity. Let's talk about it face-to-face. Let's get together and talk about it. Let's have more exchange. And I think literature and the arts are a perfect space for that, because many of the things, and that's what I really would like to stress, are not out in the open yet. So many of the prejudices or of the thoughts of what's going on is unconscious, and literature and art and the arts provide a space, a safe space, I would say, where we could express those things without having to prove everything right away. And yeah.
Yes, and also remain with the complexity.
Yeah.
We don't have to all neaten it all up, although we will neaten this evening all up by saying thank you very much to the panelists, and I'd like to thank them from Penn State All, Dr. Bettina Christic, who is the Assistant Professor of History at Penn State, Bettina Martez, Associate Professor of German, Science, Technology and Society and Women's Studies, and Philip Jenkins, the Edwin L. Sparks Professor of History and Religious Studies at Penn State. I'm Habiba Badroun, and from all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.